So, is high frequency training the holy grail of muscle growth? No. But I do think it is quite interesting, and I do think it has some utility, and I think it is worth trying. So, in this video, I'm going to share with you my experiences with high frequency training, particularly high frequency full body training. And this video is for two reasons. First, I saw a video from Basement Bodybuilding talking about how he's going to be going into doing a sort of high frequency full body experiment. And second, on my last video, I had a number of questions about frequency. And so I wanted to just share my experiences with it. Now, at first glance, this might sound ridiculous or even simply impossible.
That's impossible.
High frequency, full body, everyday training. Don't you need 48 hours or 72 hours or a week and a half or 2 weeks if you're a Mike Mentzer fan to recover between sessions? I think sometimes yes, but if you set it up well, you can absolutely do more or less full body-ish training every single day. But aren't you going to be sore all the time? When I hear these comments, I know that they haven't really given it an honest shot, and they maybe lasted like 2 or 3 days, and then they kind of just gave up. If you persist through and your exercise selection is reasonable, and you're doing reasonable volume, and you're possibly even keeping reps in reserve at first, you won't really get sore after maybe a week or 2 weeks, and certainly after 3 weeks, you're not going to be brutally sore. And if you are, something has gone terribly wrong. Often the soreness thing is when people are used to doing bro splits where they occasionally skip a day anyway. And so they're hitting their legs once every 2 weeks and they're talking about, oh, I can't get down to the toilet, man. Well, yeah, that's because you're on a low frequency program and you're basically detraining between every single session. With full body, high frequency training, it's exactly the opposite. You get used to training very frequently with low-ish volume per session, and thus you're never really particularly sore. And in fact, my experience with this was that it was a lot easier to recover than I thought it would be. We have this idea in our heads, oh, you need at least 2 days, maybe 3 days, maybe even longer to recover. But the reality is there are a lot of athletes who do train on a very frequent basis, often even 2 or possibly even 3 times per day, and yet they can recover because they are manipulating other training variables to make that possible. And the first time I actually heard of this was through T-Nation, probably close to 10 years ago, from Christian Thibodeau. He talked about doing a double stimulation training where you train the muscle once, kind of normally, typical hypertrophy stuff, and then you come back the next day, possibly when you are sore, and you actually do a lot of work to kind of flush blood into the muscle and to drive out that soreness. And you might find that, oh, the muscle's sore, of course I shouldn't do anything. But the reality is often this not only won't hurt your recovery, but it will in fact help it, especially if you choose the right exercises. If you do a whole bunch of Romanian deadlifts, really strict, sitting back, pushing the hips way back, stretching out the hamstrings, you might be sore the next day. But let's say you do some standing hamstring curls. I know this is sort of vilified because it's not a stretchy movement, but that's the reason why you're doing it. You don't want a big stretch on that second day. You want something a little bit more contraction focused. You're standing up, you're getting a big contraction at the top, and it's really good for blood flow. If you do a whole bunch of preacher curls or incline curls or some kind of Bayesian curl on one day to work the biceps, the next day, yeah, you might come in and do a few sets of concentration curls or spider curls where you can, or maybe a cable curl where you're really focusing on that peak contraction. This is not going to hurt recovery. It's not going to harm recovery. It's just not, okay? You might feel like it does, but then you do the next session and you're actually ahead of where you normally would be. By the way, this video is sponsored by me. So we just released the GVS Hypertrophy app. Feedback has been really good. We added a timer per exercise, not just for the entire workout, so you can see how long you are resting in between sets. If you have any other feedback, please let me know. You can reach out via email or via Instagram. And if you have some kind of feature that you want to add, we can absolutely hook that up. We're going to do whatever it takes to make it the best possible hypertrophy app out there. You also want a pretty good amount of variety here when people talk about, oh, do full body 3 days a week and do the same movements so you can hit the same exact fibers. To me, this is just silly. You want enough variation and variety in your exercise selection so that you are actually targeting different fibers and you are actually stressing the joints in a slightly different way. And your body can almost sense this, right? Like you might do RDLs one day and then come back, say 2 days later, and you might just, the idea of doing more RDLs just is not happening. You warm up and you can't get into it. Oh, but you do a back extension and you're totally fine. Or it could even be more subtle than that. Maybe you're doing high bar one day and then a front squat the other day, or maybe you're doing a front squat with heels elevated versus a front squat. So these really subtle shifts and changes can be enough to stress the joints in a slightly different place to where those are no longer the limiting factor. Because the reality is, especially when you get pretty strong and you are able to push yourself, the muscle is not really the limiting factor in terms of recovery. It's the joints. And a lot of the arguments against higher frequency training are a little bit silly. You hear about Mike Mentzer doing a lift every 2 weeks, or Tom Platz, he squatted every 2 weeks. And to me, I don't want to say it's irresponsible because they're just sharing their experiences, but the reality is, how many people are going to take 2 weeks to recover from one set in the gym? I mean, it's like way, way, way less than 1%. The reality is most people, they don't even need a whole week. They need probably 2 or 3 days on average for a given performance to return. So if you're like, yeah, I only do a lift once every 2 weeks because Mike Mentzer said so. Okay, well, he was a lot bigger than you, a lot stronger than you, on a whole bunch of anabolics, which allowed him to coast through, and a whole bunch of meth as well. And he probably pushed himself way harder, possibly due to that meth. Same thing with Tom Platz. You see a skinny beginner who's like, yeah, I'm only squatting once every 2 weeks, and I don't do leg press because it's an inferior exercise. And yeah, you can say the same things as he does, but you're not him. His quads are the size of your entire torso, and he's on a lot of anabolics, and he's able to push himself way, way harder than you can. So yeah, when he's squatting 5 plates for a whole bunch of reps, and you're doing a plate and a half for 10, it's just so far removed from each other that it's a fantasy. I do think that if you're a beginner, high frequency full body training close to every day, probably not as suitable, just because in that case you haven't really built up the recovery mechanisms. However, I do think there is something to doing the same lifts 2 to 3 times a week. You just don't need as much variety, and it can be a bit of a distraction. Starting strength, you're squatting 3 days a week. I think that is a sweet spot, especially on slightly more technical movements. Now, if you threw in 2 other days with leg extensions, is that going to kill you? No, but I also think it's certainly not needed, and you're probably better off saving this for a little bit further down the road. And then I think that when you're more advanced, you do have a pretty good feel for your joint tolerance, recovery, and warming up, and how you feel, and which exercises you respond best to, and which exercises you can do a little bit more frequently, and how to split everything up, and how to put exercises that are more contraction focused and easier to recover from sort of in between these bigger, harder hitting movements. And so, yeah, once you're more advanced, I think this is where in a short-term phase, like maybe a few months, throwing this in can be really, really, really good and can be a way to sort of get through some plateaus. But I also wouldn't do this all the time, and occasionally bouncing back and forth between this and then maybe more traditional splits is a good idea. I also do think that on average, different muscle groups respond a little bit better to this than others, where like you can do some kind of lateral raise variation, cable, dumbbell, whatever, machine pretty much every day and be totally fine, right? You'll just grow. Whereas if you attacked, say, your hamstrings with the same furiosity and the same volume and the same effort, probably won't end quite as well. They're notorious for getting a little bit more sore, and so you would have to be a little bit more careful with that. Every day is arm day. That's a saying. That's a thing people say for good reason. They just recover a little bit faster than some other areas. Rear delts, traps, upper back, very, very tolerant of volume and overall punishment. And I would say in general, lower body often takes a little bit longer to recover. And so, yeah, this is something where if you're doing high frequency full body every day, a lot of your lower body stuff will look maybe unnecessarily easy, right? Like, oh, I'm just doing 2 sets of leg extensions and maybe 1 set of hamstring curls or something on a day. And I guess it's still full body, but it's not like you're doing a full leg day every day. That would be entirely excessive. Also, you do have to make sure that your recovery ducks are all in a row. So sleeping, eating enough. This is not a cutting plan. If someone's like, yeah, I'm trying to get shredded, here's my plan, and it's like super high frequency, you're just not going to be able to recover nearly as well. And so this is like a main gaining to bulking, maybe a recomp in some cases if you're a little bit huskier. But in general, yeah, this is not a cutting kind of situation. Oh, I'm burning so many calories. So I hope this helped. I think in the short to moderate term, so maybe 1 to 3 months, this can work really, really well and help to bust through some plateaus. And let me know if you tried this before, and let me know sort of how you structured it. I think there's basically infinite ways to set it up, but let me know what was your preferred way. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.